Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and thank you for having me tonight. It's really a pleasure to get to be here and talk to you all about the Colorado River. I wanted to start with just giving a little bit of information about who I am and what I do in the agency I work with. So I work for the state of Colorado. I work for the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and that is a state agency that is charged, our statutory mission is to preserve and protect our state's water resources for present and future generations. So we do a lot of different things. We do loans and grants for construction projects, for water projects across the state. We have a water supply planning section that does more planning within the state. But the section I lead is called the Interstate Federal and Water Information section. And that's a lot of words to say that what I get to do and what my team does is to protect our state's interests and our interstate waters. So you may have heard Colorado referred to as the headwaters state, and what that means is there are a lot of rivers that originate in our state. We're actually party to 9 different interstate compacts, so it keeps us pretty busy defending our rights under those compacts and making sure that we're ensuring that our downstream obligations are met. So I guess full disclosure, I should say I call myself an attorney in recovery because, as I'm sure a lot of you know, once you're an attorney, you never really recover from that. So I was actually with the Colorado Attorney General's office before I came to CWCB. I worked there defending or working on behalf of the state and Colorado River issues specifically. So now at CWCB, I came over to the client side. I get to do more policy work. And I get to work in all of our state's basins, but the Colorado River takes up a whole lot of my time. And there are reasons for that. One is that we've been in a perpetual kind of state of negotiation on the Colorado River for years, but it's also critically important to our state. So the Colorado River provides 40% of our state's water supply. But zooming out a little bit, as you all know, the Colorado River it's a critical resource for the American West, for the American Southwest. It's called the hardest working river in the American West, and there are reasons for that. It provides water to 7 states in the U.S., the country of Mexico. It supplies water to 40 million people, and that includes 30 tribal nations within the U.S. The hydropower production from Lake Powell and Lake Mead and all the other hydropower production facilities across the river is critically important in terms of providing electricity to the American Southwest. But again, it's really important to us in Colorado. It originates here, provides 40% of our water supply. There's a picture here of the Colorado River through Glenwood Canyon, and it's a good reminder that it also provides, recreational opportunities. So it's not just a water supply, but it's really critical to our way of life in Colorado. A lot of people think of it as a West Slope water supply, but I'm sure as you all are aware, there are trans-basin diversions that bring that water to the Front Range as well. So you're probably drinking Colorado River water tonight. So I'm not going to talk about all this, so don't worry too much, but I wanted to just provide kind of an overview of why we've been so busy on the Colorado River for 100 years now. We refer to it as the law of the Colorado River. These are just components that regulate use of the river, that inform how it's managed, that apportion the river. So I'm going to kind of walk through some key components of this. Again, I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's critical that we start back in 1922 with the Colorado River Compact. So before I get into what's in the compact, I want to talk about why an interstate water compact. The ability of the states to create an interstate compact is in the U.S. Constitution. In the early 1920s, there was a Supreme Court case that was coming down that our own Delph Carpenter, a water attorney in Colorado, was litigating, Wyoming v. Colorado. That was before the Colorado River Compact. There was a Supreme Court decree that came out that said if 2 states or multiple states share a river, it provided a legal framework for how that water will be apportioned. And this is also a good place to talk briefly about the prior appropriation doctrine. I'm sure a lot of you are kind of familiar with that idea. First in time, first in right. So whoever develops their water first essentially has the senior right to that. They can call out water users above them, junior users, and say, you don't get your water if I don't get mine first. So there's this case, Wyoming v. Colorado. Delph Carpenter was arguing it on behalf of the state of Colorado. And ultimately what the Supreme Court decided in that case was that if you have 2 states or more that are arguing about an interstate river, prior appropriation doctrine is going to apply across state lines. Also, in the early 1920s, California is developing rapidly. Delph Carpenter is looking downstream and saying, I don't want that Supreme Court decree to apply on the Colorado River because California is going to take all of our water. And he didn't want that to happen. So the entire purpose of the Colorado River Compact was to provide Colorado and the upstream states the ability to develop into the future. It provides apportionments of the river in perpetuity. And the entire idea was to say, California, you don't have priority over us in the upper basin. I'll get into what the upper basin is in just a minute. We're standing on equal footing here. So where there is an interstate compact, and this becomes federal law, it's blessed by Congress, that kind of supersedes that Supreme Court precedent. So in other words, if there's an argument, the Supreme Court or whoever's looking at it is going to look at the compact, not that case law that has been developed, in Wyoming v. Colorado. So Colorado River Compact. I'm going to say this many times probably tonight, but it's still in place today. It's still important to us in Colorado, and no one is talking about renegotiating it. And I know that everyone likes to talk in the media and elsewhere about how we're hard at work renegotiating the Colorado River Compact, and I'm here to tell you that's not true, and there are good reasons for that. So what does the compact do? It divides the river into the upper basin and the lower basin. Colorado is part of the upper basin, along with Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming. The lower basin states are Arizona, California, and Nevada. So it starts by creating that dividing line between the upper and lower basin. It defines what the Colorado River system is, and that includes tributaries. So we're not just talking about the main stem of the Colorado River. When we talk about the Colorado River system, we're talking about the whole thing. And then it apportions that Colorado River system between the upper and lower basins. So the upper basin and lower basin each get 7.5 million acre feet of water a year in apportionments. And this is a good time to explain what an acre foot is, I suppose. So an acre foot is the amount of water that it would take to cover 1 acre in 1 foot of water. So if you look at how much water an average household uses in a year, it's about half of an acre foot. And just to put that in a little bit more perspective, some of Colorado's largest reservoirs, like Blue Mesa, for example, that holds about 830,000 acre feet. Lake Dillon, 250-ish thousand acre feet. Lake Powell, over 26 million acre feet. Lake Mead, over 28 million acre feet of water. So that kind of puts in context the scale of the reservoirs that have been built out on the Colorado River system relative to the tiny little reservoirs we have in Colorado that feel big to us. So at any rate, I just wanted to provide that context when talking about what our apportionments are. So 7.5 million acre feet a year to the upper basin, 7.5 to the lower basin, and the lower basin actually enjoys an additional 1 million acre feet of water because of some last minute questionable negotiation tactics of the state of Arizona, which we won't get into tonight. So again, that's in perpetuity. That is forever, and there's no priority between the basins. And that's the whole point of this compact. I guess continuing the false news segment of my presentation, Article 3D, you hear a lot probably about this idea of a delivery obligation on the Colorado River. And I'm here to tell you that's also not quite right. It's a non-depletion obligation, and that may be viewed by some as legal nuance or semantics, but it's actually really important. And Delph Carpenter was negotiating a lot of other compacts at this time. And if you look at some of the other compacts, like the South Platte River Compact, for example, there's a clear obligation at the state line. There's a delivery obligation in many cases. If he wanted to put a delivery obligation in this compact, he could have done that. But what this is a non-depletion obligation. And what exactly does that mean? What we believe that means in the upper basin is that we will not cause the flow of the river to drop below this certain amount. And that's 75 million acre feet at a set point on the river at Lee's Ferry, and I'll show you where that is in just a minute, over a 10-year period. So Delph knew that we had really variable hydrology in the upper basin. We rely on snowpack, right? So we can't always guarantee an annual flow of the river. We can't say a certain amount is going to be in the river year after year. So it's a 10-year obligation, and it's also, again, a non-depletion obligation. So we're not saying that no matter the circumstances, we're guaranteeing to deliver 75 million acre feet over a 10-year period. We're saying that we are not going to cause the flow of the river to fall below that. What does that mean? That's a great question. But what we would argue is that it's not the same as a delivery obligation. If there are other things impacting the river, climate change, prolonged drought, that should all be a factor when you're looking at what the causation is. So, second time I've said it, I'll say it again, the compact remains in place today. And it remains really important for us in Colorado because it gives us the ability to develop at our own pace. And we still need that, frankly. So all the other agreements I'm going to talk about tonight, everything else, it's all subject to the compact. But here's the reality of how things have worked since 1922. We've had our nation's two largest reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and I just kind of tried to give a view of just how big they are. And they're highlighted here in orange. And what you notice is they're both located below our uses in the upper basin. So you hear people say Lake Powell is our storage bucket. It's not super helpful for us, right? It doesn't really do a lot for us because that water is all stored downstream from us. We can't get it back once it's there. So here are the implications for having those reservoirs below our uses. I think we all know here in Colorado that we have really variable water supplies, right? And that's because we rely on snowpack. So year after year, our water supply is really determined by what Mother Nature provides that year. Not so much the case in California, Arizona, and Nevada, where they have enjoyed the benefits of having our nation's two largest reservoirs right above their uses. When they need water, they can just call up the Secretary of Interior and say, hey, I need some water. Can you deliver it from Lake Mead? So these are critical differences in how uses on the Colorado River have developed. And I want to explain a little bit about why that is. There's a lot happening here, and let me just take a moment to explain what it is. So the yellow dotted line you see here, that's our 7.5 million acre foot apportionment that I just explained, that we each get. That blue dotted line above it is the lower basin's apportionment with their additional 1 million acre feet. The blue line, the blue, light blue, and even lighter blue line, those are lower basin uses since 2003 for the last 20 years. And the reason there are different colors on that is because it shows main stem uses from the Colorado River itself, tributary uses, and also evaporation and transit loss. So there are reasons that I won't get into for why they're separated out. The lower basin just kind of accounts for water differently than we do up here for various reasons. But what you see is lower basin uses hovering between 10 and 11 million acre feet throughout the last 20 years. You may also know that we've been in a historic drought over the last 20 years. And this is the difference that having a 28 million acre foot reservoir above you can make, and a 26 million acre foot reservoir above that. In the upper basin, our uses are shown in this yellow line. And the first thing you might notice is that it's highly variable. And again, that's because we get our water supply from snowpack. And the way that we manage our water resources is if there's not enough, we strictly administer water rates. And by we, I mean the state engineer's office, not my agency. But he goes out and shuts people off, right? We manage based on available supply. Without large reservoirs above us, that is our only option. So we have used between 3 to 4 million acre feet less than that 7.5 million acre foot apportionment year after year. So, you hear a lot of people saying, well, the Colorado River Compact was based on an unreasonably wet period. You hear that a lot. It's true. They thought there was more water in the river than there actually is. That being said, if you read the first words of the compact, it says the purpose is to equitably divide the waters of the Colorado River. So what we would say is that even though we might not have as much water as our compact framers envisioned we would have, we should be splitting what we do have in an equitable way. There's a lot of debate about what exactly that means, but I think what we would say in the upper basin is we think this should look a little bit more even. So, continuing on, I want to talk just very briefly about Mexico's engagement on the Colorado River. And that involves a treaty that was signed actually 20 years after the compact, and then a number of what we call minutes that you all might be familiar with. Essentially, it's providing additional clarity on the treaty without actually changing it. So on the Colorado River, what that has meant in the minutes is essentially providing mechanisms for the country of Mexico to collaborate with the U.S. in water sharing agreements. But first, the treaty. So the 1944 treaty with Mexico gives Mexico an annual quantity of 1.5 million acre feet a year. They can also get up to 1.7 million acre feet, an additional 200,000 acre feet in times of surplus. In an extraordinary drought, which is not defined anywhere, that allotment can be reduced. So again, not clear what exactly that means, but I'll talk through how Mexico has shared in shortages with the states over the years. And that's where the minutes come in. So the kind of main takeaway from all this is that Mexico has been a very good partner to the United States on the Colorado River. A lot of times what you will see throughout the history of the Colorado River is that there will be a domestic agreement. For example, in the 70s, there was a Salinity Control Act, essentially regulating the amount of salinity that's in the Colorado River and looking at ways that we can reduce it. At the same time, Mexico agreed to a minute defining how we would treat the salinity, we call it the differential going into Mexico. So essentially what we're saying there is we're not going to send you water that's much more salty than the water we have here. Minutes 319 and 323 were similar in that they define how the country of Mexico would share in shortages on the Colorado River. So I'll get into that more because they really came in parallel to domestic agreements that defined how the lower basin states would take shortages. So I'm going to spend most of my time tonight talking about the current agreements on the Colorado River and frankly how they have facilitated the crisis that we are seeing on the river today. That starts back in 2007 with the Colorado River Interim Guidelines. We call them the 07 Guidelines for short. And the purpose of the 07 Guidelines, so going into the negotiation of them, there was a lot of concern that the 7 basin states were going to end up in court. It was a very dry time on the river. There was a lot of concern about Lake Powell and Lake Mead just sinking quickly. And there was a desire at that time to have better coordination of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So in other words, they didn't want to see one of the reservoirs with a lot of water in it while the other just didn't have enough. So that was kind of the intention: avoid litigation, balance the reservoirs a little bit better than they had been, and really protect the reservoirs from reaching critical elevations where hydropower production might be threatened, for example. So I'm going to get into how they worked and didn't work, but first the key components. Lower basin shortages, I'll talk about that. Intentionally created surplus, this concept that the lower basin can essentially bank water for later use in Lake Mead. And finally, Lake Powell operations. And this is really the kicker. It kind of says exactly how Powell is going to release water under various conditions. So let's jump in. Lower basin shortages. So the 07 guidelines provide a mechanism for lower basin states to take reductions from their Lake Mead supplies during certain times. So I should back up a little bit and explain another critical piece of Colorado River management. And that is that the Secretary of Interior is water master in the lower basin. So one thing you notice the compact did not do is apportion water between individual states. It was just the upper basin and lower basin. And we handled that fact very differently. So the lower basin went to court, sued each other a whole lot. And the result of that was that the Secretary of Interior is the water master in the lower basin. So if you want water in the lower basin, you have to go to Interior and get a contract. In the upper basin, we did things really differently. We actually developed our own compact apportioning our share of the Colorado River. So anyway, that is all kind of additional context that's helpful in understanding how the lower basin is participating in the 07 guidelines. So essentially the idea here is that when Lake Mead hits certain elevations, Arizona and Nevada are agreeing to take reductions to their deliveries out of Lake Mead. California is not participating in the 07 guidelines, and the reason for that is that if you look at that messy litigation the lower basin engaged in, California came out of that with the senior priority in the lower basin. So they have senior water rights relative to Arizona and Nevada, not relative to us. So the 07 guidelines provided provisions for Arizona and Nevada to take shortages under certain circumstances. And again, it's based on Lake Mead elevation. So this is just a clip, it's not a very good one, of the table, just showing when Lake Mead is at certain levels. These are the reductions that Arizona and Nevada are agreeing to take. So here's another part of the agreement, intentionally created surplus. So you may have heard about, the lower basin is saving record amounts of water in Lake Mead. They're taking these conservation measures. And a lot of that is being done through this mechanism called intentionally created surplus, where lower basin contractors can bank water in Lake Mead for later use. So they essentially have various ways that they can say, we're going to save water, keep it in Lake Mead, don't deliver it to us this year, and we're going to get that water back at a later date. There are a lot of different ways they can do this with a lot of different pretty complex rules. In some situations, like tributary conservation ICS, they can take water, they can use water from their tributaries in the lower basin and say, hey, we're using from our tributaries, don't deliver that water out of Mead, and then get that water out of Lake Mead later. If you're wondering if the lower basin has ever used this water that they have banked in Lake Mead to offset those shortages I just talked about, the answer would be yes. So if I were to go back to that graphic showing how much the lower basin has used, and you see, oh, it doesn't actually look like they took less water in that year. I heard in the news they were taking shortages. A lot of the time it's because they're taking this water that they had previously banked. And so they're continuing the same delivery out of Lake Mead. They're just shuffling things around a little bit. And here's the kind of the meat of the 07 guidelines. Again, the intention going into this was to balance the reservoirs. So if Lake Powell had a lot of water in it, the intention was we didn't want to not release that water downstream. They wanted to kind of balance Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So you have this complex table here, but essentially what it is you're going to look at the elevation, the projection for the elevation of Lake Powell on a certain date, and then you're going to look at the elevation of Lake Mead relative to that, and that's how you're going to determine your release from Lake Powell. So the reservoirs and their operations are directly linked to each other. The release from Powell is directly determined by how low or high Lake Mead is, where the lower basin gets their water supply. So, spoiler alert, that didn't work out so well. In 2019, just moving on down our law of the Colorado River, it was determined that the 07 guidelines were not working very well. The reservoirs were continuing to lower, and ultimately what happened is the basin states came together again and said, we need to do more to protect the system. At this point, there was real concern that Lake Powell and Lake Mead were going to hit dead pool. They would no longer be able to produce hydropower. So this is where the 2019 drought contingency plans come in. And this is often, these agreements were often thought of as a Band-Aid, meant to supplement the 07 guidelines. This is a good time to mention the 07 guidelines actually expire in 2026. So they were meant to be interim in nature to see how they went. And the drought contingency plans, or DCP as we call them, also meant to go through 2026. So the idea was, it's looking like we're not going to be able to keep the reservoirs as high as they should be through this period. We need something else just to get us through until we can renegotiate the 07 guidelines. So there were a lot of components of the DCP. This kind of shows all of it. In the lower basin, we essentially got more of the same. So additional shortages in the lower basin. California participated for the first time in those shortages. Additional intentionally created surplus, additional types of ICS were created where they could conserve water in different ways and bank it in Lake Mead for later use. So the lower basin DCP really built on the agreements that had come before it. The upper basin DCP was a little bit different. We agreed to two key components. One was to look at a very specific type of water conservation program, and I'll talk about what that is in a minute. And the other was what we call the Drought Response Operations Agreement. And that's a lot of words to say, we'll release water from our upstream reservoirs under certain conditions, and I'll talk about that too. So there's a lot here. Don't need to look at all this, but what I wanted to demonstrate and kind of put together is how the '07 guidelines work and how you have the minutes with Mexico as an overlay on this. So you see on the left Lake Mead elevation, and based on that elevation, you can see who is taking shortages, which U.S. states and Mexico as well. What shortages everyone in the lower basin in Mexico will be taking. So you have the '07 guidelines, and then you have the DCP on top of it, Binational Water Scarcity Contingency Plan. That's Mexico's DCP. Essentially, it's the Mexican side of that agreement. And then you see the total combined values all the way over on the right. So that's just kind of to show how this works with the U.S. states and with Mexico and how they agreed to share in those shortages. So the upper basin. Again, we agreed to two things. And one is to look at this concept called demand management. And we learned really quickly that demand management is not a good phrase to call something that you want people to adopt or enjoy. So, but here's what it is. It's the idea of temporary voluntary compensated reductions in consumptive use, water conservation. We would pay people to not use their water in a given year. But here's the thing. This type of program would have been for a very specific purpose of ensuring ongoing compact compliance. So if we were to set up this program under the federal legislation that created it, we would have to save water, figure out how to get it to Lake Powell, and then that water would stay in Lake Powell until we would need to release it to ensure ongoing compliance with the compact. So, we get a lot of questions from media and otherwise about why haven't you just set up this conservation program? You don't want to conserve water, why, And what we would say in response to that is we conserve water all the time in Colorado. We have a lot of ways that we do that, and we have a lot of ways that we pay for it. But this is a very specific type of water conservation that serves a very specific purpose. And the way that we've really been looking at it in Colorado is it achievable? Can we do it? Can you set up a program of that scale and get that water down to Lake Powell? Is it actually possible to do that? Is it worthwhile is the next question. How much water could we actually conserve? How much of it's going to be evaporated away in Lake Powell? Is it a worthwhile mechanism? And is it advisable, finally? And that kind of implicates some of the legal questions one might have about what is our compact obligation? Are we in danger of violating it? And the answer from our perspective is that we are absolutely not in danger of violating our compact obligation. We've never been out of compliance with it. Don't foresee that happening. So is it really advisable to set up this very specific type of water conservation program that was created in this federal legislation? The investigation is ongoing. It started in 2019. We've done a lot of work in Colorado looking at this type of program, but this particular agreement, again, expires in 2026. So will there be water conservation in the upper basin as part of any future agreement? Yes, for sure. Will it look exactly like this? Probably not. Because as we've kind of worked through this concept and the agreements we would need to reach and the physical realities of what it would look like, I think a lot of us have realized in the upper basin that would be pretty challenging, and there might be better ways to do that. So the other component of the, trying to get all the words on the slide here, of the upper basin DCP is this drought response operations agreement. And essentially what this does is says when Lake Powell is projected to drop to its elevation 3525, we in the upper basin agree to look at our upstream initial units. In Colorado, that's Blue Mesa. It also includes Flaming Gorge and Navajo Reservoir. And we will consider making releases from those reservoirs to protect Lake Powell. Why 3525? That's the elevation at Lake Powell where they become concerned with hydropower production. So we're essentially saying that we will lend you some water from the upper basin to keep Lake Powell above that critical elevation. We ended up releasing 624,000 acre feet of water as part of this agreement. I'll get to how that happened shortly, but that's a lot of water, especially when you look at it relative to how much we use in the upper basin. So how's it going? How are these agreements working out for us? That's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about. And also I want to just address how we're going to try to do better next time. So I guess I'm kind of cutting to the chase a little bit. But we all know the Colorado River has been in a 20-plus year drought. We have seen the lowest flows in the river in the last 23 years as we ever have. So this Lake Powell unregulated inflow is one way we look at the flows of the river. This is actually from the Bureau of Reclamation's 24-month study. Comes out every month. If you're curious about what's happening on the Colorado River, what the projections are, this is a really good place to look. They have a lot more information than this, but we all know, because we live in Colorado, that we have been facing historic drought, right? So what has happened over the course of this historic drought in terms of releases and operations from Lake Powell and Lake Mead? This is just a snapshot in time, but it is pretty representative of what we've seen over the course of the 07 guidelines. So the blue bar here is the inflow into Lake Powell in a given year. The red is the release from Lake Powell. And the red bar is higher than the blue bar, and that's a problem. So, look at 2021, for example, 3.5 million acre feet flowed into Lake Powell, 8.23 million acre feet was released. So I am not an engineer. I'm not good at math, but it doesn't take an engineer to see that that's a problem. And this has been happening for 20 years. So I'm going to come back to this because to understand why this has been happening at Lake Powell and Lake Mead, you have to understand why Lake Mead has been drawn down. So just putting it all together, the 07 guidelines, again, it's based on elevations of Powell and Mead. When Mead is really low, Lake Powell is going to release more water. That's how the reservoirs are balanced. What affects the elevation at Lake Mead, the contents of Lake Mead? It's deliveries to California, Arizona, and Nevada. That is where they get their water supply, as we all know. So throughout the years of historic drought, the lower basin has used between 10 to 12 million acre feet of water from Lake Mead. In those same years, we have seen record low inflows into those reservoirs. So again, putting this all together, I think it's pretty easy to see where the problem is. We have a serious mass balance issue at our nation's two largest reservoirs. So what we need to do is better balance our available supply with our downstream demands. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But again, this sometimes I call this slide why I haven't slept in 3 years. But I think a lot of people wonder, well, why is it that the Colorado River is I'm just now hearing about it? It's been in a 20-plus year drought. Why is it all over the news? And it's because it took a while for those massive reservoirs that started out full before the 07 guidelines to get to the point where they were this empty. So it was not until 2021, 2022 that the alarm bells really started ringing at Lake Mead and Lake Powell that we were really getting very close to reaching dead pool, which is scary. That should scare all of us. So in June 2022, the Bureau of Reclamation, which I should mention is the federal agency that operates Lake Powell and Lake Mead, they called on the basin states to reduce our uses by 2 to 4 million acre feet. That's what they thought was necessary to protect the reservoirs. We used 3.5 million acre feet in Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming, all 4 of those states combined in 2021. That's a lot of water for us. It's not as much relative to 11 million acre feet. And this is what led to us in the Upper Basin implementing that drought response operations agreement I just talked about, sending over 600,000 acre feet downstream to protect Lake Powell. We also set up a conservation program, not the demand management concept I just talked about, but essentially we just said, we need to get a conservation program set up as quickly as we can. We got federal legislation authorizing it, and we paid water users in the upper division states to not use their water. And we called that the System Conservation Pilot Program. So we did that. And we know how much water was released downstream in those years. But here's the thing, and this is where I think we all should be focusing going forward, and what I've really been working on lately is the 07 guidelines are going to expire in 2026. And if we want to stop managing the Colorado River in a crisis-to-crisis mode, we have to have better guidelines. We have to figure out how to better manage the river so that our uses are actually aligned with available supply. So in June 2023, the Department of Interior initiated that formal process through the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and kicked that whole process off. So this brings us to today. 07 guidelines expiring in 2026. That's not too far off. And I just wanted to talk about our perspective, the state's perspective, on what we should do going forward and some of the things that we've done to try to encourage what we think is wise management of the Colorado River. First, I just wanted to start with kind of a process overview. So the 07 guidelines, again, expire in 2026, so that's kind of the deadline we're working towards. But there's a lot that has to be done before that. If any of you are familiar with the NEPA process, it requires you kind of work towards a record of decision, where the federal agency releases a big long document saying this is our decision. But you have a final EIS, you have a draft EIS, you have a lot of process that goes before that. So time is really, really of the essence right now. We in the upper division states jointly submitted what's called an alternative to the Bureau of Reclamation. So essentially what we put in that is, here's how we think you should manage the river going forward. We put that forward actually about a year ago originally. We submitted some limited refinements in December. And what's happening now is essentially the Bureau of Reclamation is looking at all the ideas they got, all the alternatives they got. They have released an alternatives report is what they're calling it, which essentially details a few concepts. They haven't actually put out a draft environmental impact statement, which is a document that they would have to do before making a final decision yet. So we're still very much in federal decision-making world, which has gotten a little bit more complicated lately. But I wanted to talk through the Upper Division States Alternative, UDS Upper Division States Alternative. So Colorado, we worked together with Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming to put together a shared approach for what we think the future management of Colorado River should look like. And here's kind of the bottom line. We think that management of the reservoir should be based on available supply, not demand. So instead of looking at Pell releases based on what's happening at Lake Mead and how much water the lower basin states believe that they need or would like, we should only be releasing what's available. We should only be releasing what is sustainable for that reservoir to continue operating as it was intended. So we that was our main goal, but also to help rebuild storage. So we don't want to just kind of maintain Lake Powell at this level where it's still in danger perpetually of reaching critical elevations. We want to actually rebuild reservoir storage. We also said that we will do some voluntary conservation in the upper basin. Again, it might not look exactly like the concept of demand management. And also we're willing to continue looking at strategic releases from our upstream reservoirs to protect Lake Powell. The reality is, if you want to balance the Colorado River system, we have to have reductions in use in the lower basin. There's no way we can make it work otherwise. We could stop using all the water up here, which I don't think any of us want. But we could do everything we could possibly do, and that will not solve the problem. So for the numbers people in the room, just wanted to zoom in briefly on how our alternative actually works. At Lake Powell, you have a linear rule curve. So how this works is you look at the elevation of Lake Powell on October 1st, and based on that, that's going to give you what the release should be. So we are using the elevation of Powell, the contents of Powell, as an indicator of hydrology. So our alternative actually calls for releases of up to 12 million acre feet from Lake Powell. That's a lot of water, but only when it's healthy enough to do that. And it's going to take a while to get there, quite frankly, if it ever does again. But we go down to 5 million acre feet when needed to protect critical elevations at Lake Powell. So it's a linear rule curve. I know it looks here like it's kind of a tiered release, but it's linear. And this is another thing we learned from the 07 guidelines, that when you have sharp tiers, so in other words, when the operational decision at Lake Powell can change based on just a few thousand acre feet in the reservoir, that creates some adverse incentives, right, to try to create situations in which the release from Powell will be what you want it to be. So we thought a linear rule curve would make more sense. So that's Lake Powell operation. Again, here's the reality. Most of the cuts have to come from the lower basin. To go back to, the efforts that we are agreeing to put forward in the upper basin, voluntary conservation, one note I wanted to make about that is that we only can conserve what we're going to have available in a given year, right? So if a water user is going to get completely cut down, if they're not going to have any water supplies in a given year because a senior water rights holder is calling for that water, we can't expect them to conserve the water, right? So we're going to do our part, we're going to conserve, but we can't do it in the same way that the lower basin does it. So I just wanted to point that out before talking about the pain we suggest inflicting on our downstream friends. We know, and I think a lot of people across the basin, including the lower basin, we all understand that at least 1.5 million acre feet of reductions are needed in the lower basin. That would simply account for evaporation and transit losses of that water, and that hasn't been accounted for or considered over the years. The Colorado River has been managed under the 07 guidelines. So in most circumstances, that's going to go a long way. A 1.5 million acre foot, we're calling it an adjustment to account for evaporation and system losses. But more is going to be needed in some circumstances. And it's funny because we did our own technical work, we did our own modeling on this, and we ended up agreeing pretty closely with Bureau of Reclamation, which said 2 to 4 million acre feet is what's needed to protect the system. Turns out they were right about that. We found that reductions of up to a total of 3.9 million acre feet in the lower basin are going to reduce most of the risk that we would see. And this is all based on projections of, what type of hydrology are we going to see? In other words, what type of snowpack are we going to see? What can we expect based on historic hydrology? So this is what we put out there for analysis by the Bureau of Reclamation. But where are we today? To come back to this. We are in a space where the federal government is continuing the NEPA process. And in the meantime, we are working hard with our counterparts across the basin to try to come to a consensus approach. As you can imagine, the lower basin put forward their own alternative. Looks pretty different from ours. We're trying to find some space in the middle and trying to find a consensus that we can all live with, because we believe it is in the best interest of all of us to avoid going to the Supreme Court. That is any disputes among states about our water supplies go directly to the Supreme Court. We think that's probably not the best option for us. So we're trying really, really, really hard to reach a consensus. But for us in Colorado, our North Star has always been and will continue to be, we have to protect our water users. We have to do what's best for the state of Colorado. So we believe that that is hopefully going to be a consensus, 7 basin states that we can then take to reclamation and say, we've got it figured out. Please plug this into your NEPA analysis. But through all of that, again, our priority is protecting Colorado. So we're hoping that all of those priorities can align, but it's yet to be seen. So stay tuned.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to make sure I understand. So you showed a table that showed based on Lake Mead elevations under the current guidelines, then the lower basin states take some reduction of what they might expect. But they also can bank water. So they're allowed to take the banked water regardless of what those reductions should have been, or how does that factor in?
Generally, yes. Generally, the answer is yes, but there are certain restrictions on that. So it all kind of depends on the type of water that they banked and how they created it. There are rules about, when Lake Mead hits certain elevations, you cannot take this type of banked water out. So when it gets really low, there are some restrictions on it. But in a lot of circumstances where, you would see Arizona and California in a tier 1 shortage, for example, they could use some of that banked water to offset those shortages.
Amy, you didn't talk about megawatts at each one of the reservoirs. Couldn't you develop a criteria for, let's put the level of each one of the reservoirs to be 60% capacity in terms of megawatts? That way you could equalize things in terms of power production.
That is a really interesting concept. I don't know that we've contemplated looking at it in terms of the megawatts of power production. That is certainly part of the calculation, and our friends at Western Area Power Association tend to inform us of what that looks like relative to various levels, and we certainly consider that. But the management decisions of how to determine how much to release from the reservoirs has traditionally not been based on that factor.
You mentioned for a few minutes what Colorado might have to do to conserve more water to meet downstream compact obligations. So we were in Palm Springs area in February. Coachella Valley, from Indio on the east to Palm Springs on the west, has 11 cities in it. There are 111 golf courses in the Coachella Valley. And I know because we played 4 of them. But some of those golf courses were greener than Ireland in June. I mean, not just the tee boxes and the greens, but the fairways, the rough, everything was just green, green, green. They're using a ton of water. How do you get downstream customers like Nevada, Arizona, and California to cut back on all this sort of superfluous water use that's not really critical except to golf course business to meet their obligation to reduce their usage instead of us having to sacrifice up here to meet what they want?
It's a great question. Yep, you can clap for that. Here's one thing that is really important to understand is that 80% of Colorado River water is actually used in agriculture. So I agree with you that it is very troubling to see very green golf courses in the middle of June when it's 105 degrees. But a lot of the water is actually used in irrigated agriculture. That doesn't mean that everyone should not be making reductions and that we need to learn to live with maybe without super green golf courses at certain times of the year. But I think that the reality is that a lot of large reductions will have to come in agriculture, also in the golf courses. But
well, I guarantee you the Bellagio in Las Vegas is not growing any crops.
So I have to defend the Bellagio for just a minute, not just because I enjoy the shows, but they actually use all recycled water. So Las Vegas is actually, they do a really great job in water efficiency. Nevada actually uses less than its lower basin apportionment. So Nevada does a good job. I have to defend Vegas for a minute. I hear what you're saying. It's weird to see, but
our next question's on the other side.
Could you speak to how much the tribes have been involved with some of this negotiation, since we've all heard about Ridges Basin or Nighthorse Campbell Reservoir and that during this whole time?
Yeah, absolutely. The tribes were the key parties missing from the Colorado River Compact, so they had no role in apportioning the water supplies. The way that the law developed after that was that tribal water rights have to come out of the state's apportionment in which they reside. But the federal government also has a trust responsibility to the tribes to help them make full use of their water. You also may be familiar with the Winters Doctrine, a Supreme Court decree that says tribes are entitled to the water that they would have needed to use for their reservation. And that priority date goes all the way back to the date of their reservation. So that's all to say it's a mess. But it is, I think, one of the big failures on the Colorado River that we have not involved the tribal nations. We've tried to address that in Colorado. We've developed really great relationships with the 2 tribes that rely on the Colorado River, the Southern Ute Tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, and have tried to get them more involved and have more of a voice in management decisions, and I think that's been really effective. All the Upper Basin states have developed better relationships with the Upper Basin tribes. Probably heard in the news lately, tribes in Arizona, the Navajo Nation in particular, are trying to settle their water rights with the state of Arizona. But when you go back to that fact that a tribe's water rights have to come out of the apportionment for that state, and states that are already using more than their compact apportionment, create some challenges.
So, Amy, thank you. You mentioned the agricultural uses of the water. So we know that both basins are primarily in the desert. Okay, so a significant portion of water from the Colorado Basin is used to produce alfalfa,
Yep.
which is used for animal feed.
Yep.
Okay, you're trying to grow alfalfa in the desert, which is
Yep.
a water-intensive crop. Why not pay farmers in the Midwest where there is water to grow alfalfa and then ship it by rail car to the Western ranchers who use it for animal feed and thereby conserve the water you would otherwise use to grow alfalfa in the West?
Problems for us. But here's the tricky reality is that there is a serious economic driver here, right? In Southern California and in Arizona, frankly. I said 80% of the water in the Colorado River is used in agriculture, and something like 80% of that is used to grow alfalfa. And a lot of that is in Southern California, and a lot of that is in Arizona. And they have developed an economic reliance on that. And I don't want to downplay how hard it would be for them to shift away from that. But that's a reality we all have to face. We did have a lot of funds in the Inflation Reduction Act. You may have heard $4 billion going to the Colorado River to try to reduce some of that use. You may have also heard that that money in the Inflation Reduction Act has since been clawed back. So it's a complicated situation that we find ourselves in. It's a little political, yeah.
Two questions. One is, what percentage of evaporation occurs? It's a dry area, the West. How much is lost each year that you send downstream just to evaporation? The second question is the one, whatever happened to the draw that the Nebraska governor was going to take from eastern Colorado?
Yeah, okay. I'm from Nebraska originally, so this is an awkward topic for me, but we'll come back to that one. So evaporation, it's interesting because it kind of depends on how full the reservoirs are. So when Lake Mead is fuller, there's more evaporation happening because it's kind of a teacup. So at any rate, average in the lower basin, 1.5 million acre feet of water is evaporated or lost in transit. In the upper basin, I cannot think of the exact number off the top of my head. We calculate water use a little bit differently. So it's kind of built in. So the numbers that I showed for the upper basin, evaporation, transit loss is all built into that. I'm not going to give you a number because I'll get it wrong, but it's 1.5 in the lower basin. In Nebraska. That's another tricky topic. I asked Nebraska, could you not have waited until 2026 when we had the Colorado River figured out to start building this canal that you would like to build in Colorado, but they didn't want to wait. So Nebraska, as some people may be aware, is citing another 100-year-old compact and their right to build a canal in Colorado under the terms of that compact. So they waited quite a while, and just a few years ago announced their intention to build the canal in Colorado. Nebraska has recently sent letters to the landowners where that canal would be, saying that they will be initiating condemnation proceedings. They have set aside $600 million in their state budget for construction of the canal. It's a situation we're tracking very closely. We're talking to Nebraska and trying to figure out why they're wanting to build such an expensive canal for such a small amount of water. The other thing that's important to understand there is that we have a 3-state program. Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming. I'm actually the representative for Colorado in that program. It's been working effectively for a long time. It's an ESA compliance program. It provides protection for the habitat exclusively in Nebraska of these endangered species. And Colorado had previously agreed to provide a certain amount of water for that program. If Nebraska builds the canal, a lot of the water rights that they'll be calling out with that senior priority of the canal is the water that we currently provide to that program. So it's complicated.
We have our next question here, and then we'll pop back over to us.
There it goes. This is a little wonky.
Still can't hear you. Let me see. There we go.
It's a little wonky. We have X amount of million gallons of water that we donate from our snowpack. And at what point do we draw the line and say, this is how much our snowpack is, and this is how much we're going to contribute to the Colorado River Basin this year that needs to be allocated?
That's a good question. So 13.5 million acre feet originate in Colorado from our snowpack. That is a lot of water. We send 40% of that downstream to other states. I would love to just build a wall on the state line and keep all that water for ourselves. It would be physically and legally difficult to do that. Physically, I'm sure you can understand why it would be hard to capture that amount of water. But legally, we do have downstream obligations. So we do have certain obligations we need to meet. Have we been over meeting them in some cases? Perhaps. But I think, that is something that we have to consider going forward is how do we in Colorado make maximum use of our compact apportioned waters? How do we make sure we're protecting that water for future generations? It's something we think about a lot. But our storage buckets up here are a lot smaller than they are downstream. So that creates some operational challenges for us.
This is a follow-up question to that, really.
Okay.
You said the Upper Basin has 7.5 million acre feet that we're entitled to, and we're not using it all. So over the next 20 years, Colorado may double its population, or Colorado, Wyoming, whatever. Does that mean we can use as much of that 7.5 million gallons as we can use, and that the lower basin is going to have to adjust to it? That if we double our population, we're going to need much more water. We can use as much as we want up to the 7.5 million gallons, and then the lower basin is going to have to figure it out.
Depends on whose lawyer you ask. To be honest, we would say that the compact gave us the ability to grow into that apportionment in perpetuity. The physical reality is it's hard to put that much to use when we're in drought years. Again, that's because of how we strictly administer water rates. So if you look at just how an individual subbasin is managed, for example, if it's a really dry year, junior users are getting cut back just to make sure that you can get water to senior water rights holders. We have a lot of really senior water rights holders who are way in the southwest corner of the state where the Colorado River leaves the state. So that alone creates some challenges in terms of, developing that apportionment. But the other thing I want to point out is that, in terms of municipal growth, the cities on the Front Range have been doing a phenomenal job of using water very efficiently. So they have lower per capita use now than they did 20 years ago. So I would imagine that as the Front Range grows, they're going to figure out how to reuse water. They're going to figure out how to be more efficient with it as they have in the past. So I am not as concerned about that part of the equation as other parts.
We'll get this side and then Rebecca.
What about the underground water that there is a lot in Colorado?
I was actually going to talk about the underground water in Arizona, but there are, well, yeah. So there aren't a lot of there's not a lot of groundwater supplies in the Colorado River Basin, unfortunately, that we can access. So that's not a major supply for us in the Colorado River Basin in Colorado. Arizona, on the other hand, has taken a decent amount of Colorado River water out of Lake Mead and pumped it into the ground. That's what I thought you were going to ask about. So I'll just leave that there.
So, how much water would be in Lake Mead or Lake Powell at Deadpool?
How much water would be in Mead
Lake
or Powell?
Powell at Deadpool.
Oh gosh. I can't remember the exact number. I want to say it's around 5 million acre feet, but don't quote me on that. Not a lot. But I should clarify that there's a decent amount, or there's a, below where you can produce hydropower, you can still store a decent amount of water. You just can't get it out. So it's not super helpful.
That leads to a question that I have. So in worst case scenario, because I imagine in policy land, you have to think of all of the conflicts that could arise, or worst case scenario, doomsday scenarios. If it were to go down to Deadpool, what would be the outcome of that? What's your worst case scenario you've had to look at with policies?
Oh gosh. Well, we saw that. It did happen. Powell did reach 3525, and we sent over 600,000 acre feet of water downstream from Lake Powell. But we also saw in that time the Bureau of Reclamation take some emergency action at Lake Powell. So they reduced the delivery that was supposed to happen under the 07 guidelines. They actually went below that. So I think you would expect to see, the Bureau of Reclamation stepping in and doing something. What will that be in the future? It's unclear. But reduced releases from Lake Powell, upstream reservoir releases, we can't voluntarily conserve our way out. We can't conserve our way out of that in the upper basin. There's no way that we could conserve the amount of water that would be needed to keep Powell operating. But look at Flaming Gorge, for example. It has a decent amount of water in it. Not enough, year after year to be making releases. But that's where a lot of that 600,000 plus acre feet came from. So that's the type of thing that I would expect.
Thanks. Hi. Out of curiosity, with regards to water intensive technology that is coming forward rather rapidly, do you have what that might be and what the impact may be on water usage and conservation?
Yeah, water intensive technology, it's a problem. There have been a few new, what are they called, the chip manufacturing plants that have gone in Arizona recently. Here's the deal. We historically have said each state needs to manage its own water supplies within its compact apportionments, right? So in Colorado, we have a way that we do that. We strictly administer water rights. So any new water right that would come online would have a junior priority. So they would take water subject to a lot of risk. There's a good chance they're not going to get it in certain years. That is a little bit different than how our downstream neighbors have operated. So is there a danger in developing a reliance on water that will not be there in the future? Yeah, I think absolutely there might be.
Our next question is
Is there talk of creating more reservoirs or doing away with any of the reservoirs?
There's always talk about both those things. There have been some notable reservoir expansion projects in the state of Colorado. Mostly, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about a lot of things relating to those. Again, it comes down to how water rights are administered, right? So expanding a reservoir, having a junior water right, you are doing that subject to a lot of risk. That is helping those cities manage that risk so that they can take water in wet years and get through the dry years. It's helping them really manage the risks of climate change that are being imposed upon them. So I think that there are projects that are kind of on a small scale relative to the problem that we have. There are those who think we should decommission Glen Canyon Dam or Lake Powell. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
My question is related to where you get your water from and where it returns to. Here in Mount Vernon, we have water from Clear Creek and water from Bear Creek. And we have to balance our return by leach fields so that it is equal to what our water rights are. Why don't the cities on the Front Range, including Denver, who use Colorado River water, have to take their water back to the west slope and put it back in the Colorado River?
Okay. Well, actually, legally in Colorado, transbasin diverters have to use to extinction their Colorado River supply. So I'm glad you brought this up because there's been a lot of information out there about reuse and water recycling in the state of Colorado and in the upper basin. It works really, really differently up here than it does in other places, and it works different even on the Front Range than it does on the west slope. So in most circumstances, if you are using a certain amount of water, a good percentage of that is going to return to the river's return flows. And some people say, well, that's not a very efficient use of water. And what we would say is that's actually a highly efficient use of that water because it's going to get reused probably 7 times before it leaves the state. It's not by the same person, but it's going to get reused, downstream reused before it leaves the state. So that's actually a highly efficient system. And the water rights of the downstream water holders rely on those return flows. And the whole regime of how the river operates relies on those return flows. So that's important, but on the Front Range, it's a little bit different. They have to reuse their transbasin water supplies to extinction. So that creates an incentive for folks like Denver Water to figure out how they can reuse that water as much as they possibly can. I think it's an interesting concept to have them, have to return that river to the west slope. But I think that our water rate system has actually resulted in highly efficient uses on both sides of the Continental Divide. It just looks a little bit different. Oh, and I will also say, sorry, one important note on that is that in a lot of those big storage projects on the Front Range, the Front Range entities have actually agreed to provide mitigation projects on the West Slope. So you have certain reservoirs on the West Slope that are specifically designed to mitigate the impacts of those Front Range deliveries. So they might not be shipping the water back to the West Slope, but they are providing some, and it kind of varies by project, but they are providing some alternative source on the West Slope.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.